Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
While a majority of Americans approve of the death penalty, fewer do now than did in 1972, according to a recent Gallup poll. Other surveys are showing a similar trend. One of the main arguments in support of the death penalty is that it offers justice and closure to the victims' families. But research shows that's not always the case. This month on Access Minnesota, we sit down with University of Minnesota professor Mark Umbreit, who, along with a Texas University colleague, co-wrote a study comparing the impact of the death penalty on murder victims' families in Minnesota and Texas. The results call into question the belief that the death penalty provides the sense of justice and closure that most murder victims' families and friends seek. Mark Umbreit is a professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. He's also the founding director of the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking. Professor Umbreit, welcome to Access Minnesota.
I'm glad to be here.
You recently co-wrote a study with University of Texas professor Marilyn Peterson. It won UT's Best Research Paper Award last year. The study compares murder victims' families in Minnesota and Texas. Tell us more about the study and why Minnesota and Texas were two states that were chosen for the focus of the study.
Well, this was the first study ever done looking at the impact of the ultimate penal sanction, either the death penalty or life without parole, on the healing process of family survivors. There's been many studies of the death penalty looking at their impact on crime rates and costs, all kinds of issues. But no study has ever looked at, does the death penalty really help with the healing process of victims, granting them closure? That's one of the strongest justifications behind public support for those who believe in the death penalty. So this was challenging this. We selected Texas and Minnesota because they represent states that have very different policies and practices over the decades. You know, Texas executes quite a few. Minnesota has not for a long, long time. And so we did a longitudinal study at 4 different time points after sentencing, and we found some very, very interesting information.
Tell us about the differences you found in the families in Texas and Minnesota.
Well, all of the families had loved ones murdered. But the differences we found in Texas, during time 1, within a year of the sentencing or the year of the crime event, there was tremendous support given, involvement of victims in the prosecution process, high level of trust developed, more so than in Minnesota, even though there was some of that in Minnesota too. But in the long term, time 4, after 15 years even, there was clearly a greater sense of not closure, but being able to move on in life, a greater sense of well-being, putting it behind, moving on in life essentially in Minnesota. So there were really mixed data. This was not the kind of study that was pro-death penalty or anti-death penalty. It was really looking deeper than that. It was really looking at the impact on the families that were traumatized by the loss of loved ones. It was not just looking at policy. Frankly, it's the kind of study that any ideologue from either position could cherry pick certain pieces and say, aha, this justifies the death penalty, or does not. But anyone who looks at the real meaning would find something very, very different. There's lessons to learn for both Texas and Minnesota.
Why do you think the victims' families in Minnesota, a state without a death penalty, had more satisfaction with the criminal justice system than the families in Texas did?
Well, that seems fairly clear. The process in Minnesota moved along fairly quickly. The process in Texas could be drawn out 10 years or longer. There was a greater sense of completion of the criminal justice process. Victims' families, homicide survivors, were not living with all the anxiety of what's happening in courts and the appellate process going on and on and on and on, always being a part of their life. That's clearly the difference.
What are polls showing currently regarding Americans' support for the death penalty?
Well, there's a lot of mixed information. But there's some growing data showing that, I mean, if you ask Americans just a simple question, are you for or against the death penalty? There are polls that show that the majority of Americans are in support of the death penalty. On the other hand, if you ask a little more nuanced question, you know, if there was an alternative that kept murders in prison without parole, would you be for or against it? Then it changes the data. If Americans are given cost information, if they recognize the enormous cost of execution, it's a myth to think it's cheaper to the taxpaying public to execute. That's true if the person wants to be executed, but that's not usually the case. The appellate process goes on and on and on. The cost is huge. And what we're seeing in a growing number of states, even very conservative states, we're finding, research has shown through the Innocence Project, that there have been a growing number of people convicted of murder that did not commit it. DNA evidence has shown that. And for example, Governor Ryan in Illinois years ago, Republican governor, put a ban on executing any individuals, a moratorium on it because of that, because of basic issues of fairness. That issue is being looked at in a number of other states too.
What are the trends regarding the public's attitude towards the death penalty in the United States? Are we seeing growing support or declining support?
It depends on which way you look at it. I would say in general, more cautious support and declining. Personally, I think it's just a matter of time, and that time might be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or longer. Before that will be really a policy of the past. Europeans, very few Americans realize how we are looked at with our European allies. If Osama bin Laden, when he was alive, had been arrested in any European country, he could not by law, European law, be extradited to the United States, because we are on a list that every judge in Europe has, a list of countries that violate human rights, and Americans would not be proud of who else we're on that list with. You know, that's how firm Europeans feel against the death penalty. But let's put this in historical context. It's not because they haven't been involved in this stuff. My gosh, they used the death penalty in some of the most brutal forms imaginable, but it was kind of flushed out of their cultural reality, their experience, having war on their own soil, seeing the limited impact of it. But you know, this study really went to questioning one of the strongest underpinnings of the death penalty. And by the way, it was an exploratory study. It can't be generalized across board, but it begs the question and the need for a larger national study that can deal with a far larger sample, including surveying every state. And we're hoping we can receive funding for that at some point.
Why do some, do you think, believe that the death penalty brings more closure to victims' families?
Well, that is a very widespread belief, and some would believe it's a way of kind of sanitizing the death penalty, what others would view as it's a fairly barbaric kind of thing, but there's sort of a ritual put into it to make it look very orderly, and the belief that it helps with closure and healing of victims makes it easier for some to justify it. I mean, I've known wardens that were responsible for execution, and they are some of the most outspoken people against it. They know what it is about, and they've seen the reality, and it's an awful kind of thing to witness and be in charge of.
When Access Minnesota returns, more of our conversation with Dr. Mark Umbreit about his death penalty study. We'll also hear about a process called Restorative Justice, which focuses on the needs of the victims of crimes and trauma.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.